Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking all things coaching with Dr. Shane Pill. Shane, welcome.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Super excited to have you on. This has been some time in coming. It's taken us a good couple of years to get it done, but we're here. Let's start where we always start, by getting you to introduce yourself.
I'm a father of three, been married for 35 years, born on Kaurna land, lived in Perth for 9 years, returned to Kaurna land to teach, found myself as a deputy principal in a school, and after 4 years of that, had to make a decision about whether I continued on a principal pathway. While I was attracted to the idea of being a principal, I wasn't attracted to the idea of being a deputy principal and the jobs that are associated with that. I was driving home from somewhere during the term 3 school holidays, having this conversation with my wife going, yeah, I'm in an office all day wearing a suit. Yeah, I never really saw me being that sort of guy. And she said, well, there's a job going at Flinders University in teacher education. Why don't you have a dip at that? So I took 2 years leave without pay, having won that position. And now I've been at Flinders University for 17 years. So the ledger's not quite square yet. I was a teacher for 18 years and I've been a teacher educator for 17 years. So getting close to squaring the ledger. So I've been in education, though, 35 years.
What's your main sport, Shane? What sports do you love? What do you coach?
It's a good question. So I grew up around football, Australian football, AFL clubs. My father is a stairway of fame at the club that he played for, which is SANFL, South Australian National Football League club. That was the highest you could get in South Australia before the AFL came along. Played 252 games, club captain. Could have possibly gone on and played 300 games, but he could earn more money working for my grandfather running the Melbourne book at the races than what he could playing football. So even though the club wanted him to continue, he had 3 kids and had to go where the money is, and he loved the races anyway. So my grandfather was a grandstand bookmaker, having worked through from the Derby, was the flat to the Derby to the grandstand. So I had that sort of sporting background on one side of the family. My father played squash recreationally after playing football, so I grew up around squash courts. My mum would play squash. My uncle played squash. So I have a strong attraction to the game of squash, and actually played tonight before coming on the show. So at 56 and a bit years of age, still having a little bit of a whack around. I played a little bit of football myself, but got injured at the start of the 87 pre-season, tore my driver from underneath the kneecap and missed that whole season, and only ever got myself fit enough again to play one more league game. So gave football away, did triathlons for a little while, played A-grade touch football for a little while in my 30s, went and played masters squash in my mid-40s, and squash is the sport that I've returned to play. And I'm still coaching. I currently coach a Division 2 Adelaide Football League women's team.
You've been immersed, therefore, in Australian sport for the last, let's say, 45 years, a player, a coach, and an academic. What makes Australia so good at sport, Shane?
Well, actually, it's probably I've been immersed in sport for 56 point whatever years I am now. Because, my father was playing league football when I was born. So I grew up around football clubs. My mother was playing midweek ladies tennis and midweek ladies squash to keep fit, and then squash on a Friday night with my auntie, who was a pennant grade squash player. At those squash courts, I got to have a hit with Chris Dittmar, for example, as a warm-up, because he was at Alban Squash Club where Mum and Dad played, and there were other Australian champions that just happened to be there and looking for a hit, grab the kid, come have a hit. So I've been around sport for all my life. What makes Australians good at sport is a really interesting question, because some of the data would say that we're around 140th out of 147 countries in the world for physical activity. So our adolescents are in the bottom quartile of physical activity globally. There's probably 50-odd% of kids reaching secondary school without coordination and control of the movement competencies that are benchmarked for about grade 4. So our sporting prowess seems to come from being very good at identifying and nurturing ability and fostering that ability. We have nearly 70 to 75% of kids during primary school play club sport of some sort, whether that be calisthenics, surf lifesaving, swimming, Australian football, netball, basketball. So the majority of young people are taken to sport, but the majority of Australians don't continue to play sport after adolescence. That tells me that we're very good at identifying and nurturing talent from a fairly early age.
That sounds pretty extraordinary. I think sometimes the perception from the outside looking in is that you're a nation of sports lovers. Everybody plays sport. Everybody is outdoors doing sport. But from what you're saying, and it's quite scary, because you have been very successful in sport as a nation over the last 40, 50 years. And wow, if you increased participation for a lifetime, then that could. I'm not saying that would definitely have a correlation with elite level success, but you could potentially broaden that elite level success, couldn't you?
That sounds a reasonable hypothesis.
Yeah.
It would certainly lead to a healthier community, because people would be more active more often.
Yeah.
And more active with others more often.
When did coaching become something of interest to you?
Alan Launder said to us at Teachers College that as physical education teachers, some of the most impactful work that we will do will be in community sports coaching. That as phys ed teachers will be called upon to coach school sports teams. If we were posted to a country school, we'd find ourselves being called out to coach in community settings. We'd be the parents that are called upon to coach our kids' teams because we were phys eders. And that was quite prominent in my experience, both from graduation and then as an adult as well, where people go, well, you're the phys ed, so can you do X? I started doing a little bit of coaching in the terms of coaching clinics when I was still at Teachers College, and the football club would send you out to do some coaching clinics with various groups, and people heard you're a phys ed teacher and they'd ask you to come out and help run some coaching clinics. When I started teaching in 1988, I coached my first team. It was a year, from memory, it was a year 8 Australian rules football team. Then the next year, I moved from Christian Brothers College, Fremantle, to a full-time permanent position at Newman College, which was a Marist Brothers senior secondary school. So years 10, 11 and 12, ages, would be 15 to 19-year-olds. And the deputy principal's come up to me and gone, I've been the first 18 coach, but I don't want to do it anymore. I'm too busy as the deputy principal. You've played a little bit of league football, so you're doing it. I went, hang on, I'm only 4 years older than some of these year 12s. No, you're doing it. And so not only did I get thrown into being the first 18 football coach at 22 point something years of age, because my birthday's late in the year. So at the start of the year, I'm often younger than people born in the same year as me. The school also had a really strong culture of sport driven by the head of physical education, who was also the sports coordinator. So we were regularly the Division 1 All Catholic Colleges athletics champion, swimming champion. We won the majority of the All Catholic Colleges summer and winter sports. The school prided itself on being successful in sport, and so I was immersed into that. So as a phys ed teacher in the school, I was expected to do my duties at swim training a couple of afternoons a week. Same, I became the school's sprint coach, coaching the sprinters, coaching the first 18 football team. We started up a rugby program. There was a few South Africans coming across in the 1990s, and I loved them in my first 18 football team because they tackled hard. If they were halfbacks, they had generally reasonable kicks, and they said, yeah, but we'd like to play rugby. So we got the Irish expats decided to sponsor us and play a few games against us, and that eventually led to a rugby program starting off. A few girls said we want to play cricket, got the cricket club from the school involved, and we started a girls' cricket team, for example. So I've got a history of not only coaching but also, I guess, initiating sport programs, mainly through schools with the initiation of it. But certainly my coaching started with school teams, then branched out into coaching community teams, and then semi-professional for a couple of years as well.
If I'd been by the side of the pitch, the court, the course, the swimming pool, and I was watching Shane Pill coach, what kind of things might I have witnessed?
You'd witness me talking about the game to my assistant coaches and strategizing how I would need to speak as well as what I would need to speak during breaks. You'd see a strong focus on development and less of a focus on winning. Early on, you would have seen very structured training sessions, very similar to the very structured physical education sessions that I was running. That came from the idea of set induction, which was very big in our teacher education. The markers are out. The field is set. So when they come out, they go, ooh, what are we doing today? Look at all those markers. And there's a yellow set over there. And that means there's a white set over here doing something different. And then you would have seen that evolve into more game-based training, starting training sessions and my phys ed classes with some form of game, finishing with some form of game. And over time, you would see me doing less instruction, less emphasis on providing feedback to improve aspects of performance during the game, and more feedback on how people were adhering to the, I don't know how to phrase this, the markers, the elements that we've been practicing of how we were going to do things, so that there was information was completely aligned to how we'd been practicing to play and were we executing that. I grew up in an era where it was quite common to have coaches yelling instructions from the sidelines. People would probably observe me now and go, oh, geez, you're very calm in the coach's box. So that's an evolution, but it's also a social evolution from a period that I grew up in, which, again, everybody used to bark instructions from the sidelines to help the team get organised. I'm not talking about being derogatory or negative towards players, but helping them to structure up and helping them see things they haven't seen. Whereas now I try to structure the training session so that regardless of the age group that I'm playing with, the more experienced players in the group become capable of providing that information on the ground to the players. Players don't have to wait for a break, a runner, me to get the information out to them. They're empowered to make those decisions through their team leaders out on the field.
So back in the late 80s, early 90s, I would have seen a coach who was focused on development. I would have seen a coach focused on structure and organisation. It was important to you what you were saying and how you were saying it. Now, within your description there was an interesting point where you said there was a shift from structure and organisation, and I'm not suggesting that left you in any respect, but you became more games based. Can you talk to us a little bit about that evolution, where that came from, what was the spark, and what was the aesthetic shift there? What if I had turned up again, maybe, I don't know, Shane, you can fill this in for me, but mid or late 90s or something, and I was looking at games based more so than sort of drill based, if you like, for want of a better term. Tell me about the evolution there. What happened and what did that start to look like?
So originally you would have seen what at Teachers College was described to us as the ideal lesson plan, which would have progressed from closed to open drills to some form of match simulation, in that logical, as it was described to us, progression from closed to progressively more open drills, culminating in putting what had been learnt into context in the game towards the end. The stimulus for me thinking of doing things differently was the head of department at Newman College. And he'd been trained in the UK, and I don't know whether that was significant or not, but he would start every lesson with gameplay. And while I reflect and would chat with him that I didn't think the tactical or technical ability of the players, my students, was any different at the end of the unit of work between his class and my class, I started to reflect that I wanted to be in his class. And if I wanted to be in his class, that was telling me that I should do my practice more like his practice, because that's the practice that I would enjoy most. Now, I get it. People describe me, I'm a player. I like to play things. I'm not a runner. I'm not going to go for 5, 6, 7K runs. I'm going to have a hit of tennis or a game of squash. So I get it. I'm a player. And Brian's lessons were about playing games. And Brian would say to me, oh, maybe I need to do a bit more of the drill stuff you're doing, because some of the players might need that because they're not developing within the game. And so maybe I need to exit them and give them a different teaching style to help them when they return to the game. And I'd be going, yeah, I need to tell me why you're starting with a game. I think I need to do that because that would give me more joy than starting with a drill. I reckon I would come to class with more energy and enthusiasm. And the language I used to use was shift from, are we going to play a game today, to the question at the start of the lesson, what game are we playing today? And that was the shift that I wanted to have in what the students and my athletes were chatting with me. They come to training, they come to my class and go, what game are we playing today? Not, when are we going to play a game? So Brian was really the stimulus for it. And I started to play around with the ideas in my PE class. And then I forget the year, it was somewhere around 1992 to 1994. I can't remember exactly what year. I did my level 2 coaching course. Now, around about that time, the game sense approach was being workshopped around Australia. It hadn't been released yet, but the ideas were being discussed. Rick Charlesworth had released an article in Sports Coach Journal, so it must have been around 94 that I was doing this course, on designer games. And his description of designer games read like what Brian was doing in his class. And so that gave me, that notion of designer games gave me a language for what it was that I was trying to do, and a purpose, package technical, tactical, and fitness components into a game, rather than start from the premise that they needed to be separated out into their isolated bits and then put back together. So it was a change from progressive part pedagogy to whole part whole, if you like, as an analogy, but the whole wasn't necessarily complete, but a representation of the whole. So there was a game with a learning intention. There was practice for either those players that needed to practice, or for the whole group if the whole group needed to be practiced, and then to find out whether the practice had had an effect and for who it had had an effect, we need to go back to the game. So whole part whole. So that was the shift there. And then I read about the game sense approach, and that would have been around about 1995. And that further made sense to me. The analogy of game sense is game intelligence, developing thinking players, that resonated with me. I was reading about decision making, and that the best players were always the best decision makers. They made their decisions faster and consistently more accurately than the less skilled players. So the game sense approach gave me a model to develop that with my players. So initially I took that into my football coaching, and then we were asked to be a trial school for the new curriculum framework in Western Australia, which brought a stronger emphasis on developing students as active constructors of their own learning. And the game sense approach seemed to be well suited to that curriculum direction. Then I moved back to Adelaide in 1996, and it was a low socioeconomic school, and the young phys editors there said to me, look, it's not working. We need to try something different. We started to talk about what that difference might be. And I said, look, I've been playing around with this idea called the game sense approach and being game-based. Why don't we give that a go? And because if you're telling me what we're currently doing is not working, let's work with what the literature says motivates people to be physically active, and that's playing games. And we redesigned our physical education curriculum from year 8 through to year 12 on the notion of the game sense approach. We finished off with a thematic curriculum based on game categories by the time I left there 6 years later. And one of the indications that I took for success was when I landed at the school, I had 4 students out of a final year cohort of 54 doing year 12 PE. the year I left, there were 22 students out of a class of 56 going into doing Year 12 PE. We doubled to 2 semesters of PE in Year 11. We'd introduced an elective class in Year 9, and we had massively increased the number of school students representing school sport teams, all on the basis of changing our pedagogical approach to PE in that school. So some people would say to me that you can only do a game sense approach with more capable players and more compliant players. This was a school that had significant social economic struggles in its population group, and it was a success.
Pedagogy being the science and art of teaching and learning, listening to what you're saying, central to your pedagogical approach was participation, engagement, player engagement first and foremost. That's what I'm hearing. Maybe I'm wrong here. I'm listening as a sports psychologist, and I'm thinking participation, engagement. I'm thinking turning up the volume of player, person attention, turning up the volume of their interest level. As you said, these are people who just want to play. By and large, these are people who want to play. So it feels like it had a participation element first. That's not to discount the learning piece, but we have to help players be engaged here.
Well, I think that's right, but I also trained in an era where active participation was one of the mantras from PE. And so that's something that stays with me as a framing when I'm thinking about a practice environment, maximising the active participation. So touching the ball more often, making decisions more often.
Yeah.
And from what I understand now of reading the literature, the more often you make decisions, the more often you touch the ball, the more likely you are to develop. You can't become a better player if you're not playing, if you're not actually engaged in the play.
And I think this, if we're thinking of games-based approaches, again, my perception as a sports psychologist is actually for those coaches who are greedy. Essentially, they want their players to experience engagement, but they also want a process that enables players to improve, let's say, their game intelligence, their awareness, their anticipation, their decision making as a consequence of being more involved, whether that's actively more involved or whether it's cognitively, intellectually more involved. A games-based approach can help that. It's greedy because it's technical, tactical, physical, and mental. Now, you mentioned Rick Charlesworth, who those listening in who don't know him, he was the Hockey Roos, very successful Hockey Roos coach, wasn't he? And yes. You mentioned designer games. You also mentioned game sense approach, which we've talked about on the Sports Psych Show before. We had Dr. Stephen Harvey on talking about teaching games for understanding. There are, and I know we've conversed about this on the Twitter sphere, both of us, there are so many different GBA, games-based approaches, is this umbrella term, and there's lots of different approaches. I mean, are there big differences between the different approaches, Shane?
No.
Okay.
No, there are nuances.
Yeah.
And some of the approaches address ambiguities or gaps in previous explanations. So if we have a look at TGFU, my take on TGFU is it has many similar elements to Maldon and Redfern's work from the late 1960s. They describe game categories, they describe principles of play, they describe using an inquiry approach. TGFU put that into a model and an explanation that was unique as a model and an explanation, but the ingredients we can find in descriptions of Wade's work, Eric Worthington's work, Maldon and Redfern's work from physical education settings. Now, I came late to hearing about TGFU because TGFU wasn't part of my teacher college experience. It wasn't part of my professional development when I was in service. What I heard about was designer games, then a game sense approach, and then it would have been late 1990s, I got hold of Mitchell Griffin and Osland's Teaching Sports Concepts of Tactical Games approach. And that had many similar elements to what I was reading about designer games and the game sense approach. More structured than the designer games and the game sense approach, more whole part whole So that linear progression through, and I'll talk about where a game sense approach or a designer games approach might be a little bit different from that linearity. And then reading about that, I understood that they took the 6-step model of TGFU and simplified it to a 3-step model. But it's still 3 steps, 1, 2, 3. TGFU is 6 steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if you're not doing those 6 steps in that order, it seems logically you're not doing TGFU, you're doing something else. And when I see video descriptions of people who say they're doing TGFU, often it looks more like a game sense approach because they're not doing the 6 steps. I think it was in Lynn Kidman's first book that Rod Thorpe said the game sense approach was closer to their original ideas. Now, I don't know where the 6-step model came from, but I was having a chat with one of the with Len Armand in 2013 in Auckland, and he was wondering why people were struggling with the TGFU approach and not adhering to it. I said, well, I wonder if it's because people don't really get how to go step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They get game, practice, game, but starting with game appreciation, that's a significant step. What do the rules allow you to do, not allow you to do? Having that conversation is often missed in my observation. And he said, oh, yeah, we thought we needed a model to lay it out so people could see it. And that actually came in fairly late in our decision about what we were going to put out. Now, I don't know whether that's right or not, but that was Len's memory of it at the time. So to summarise, we've got the TGFU, which is a 6-step model, which is simplified into a 3-step model for the tactical games approach. The tactical games approach added an assessment instrument where TGFU was largely silent on tools or mechanisms to do the assessment of players' development over time. The tactical games model laid out a very strong structure of off the ball, on the ball tactics and principles of play. So provided a really strong framework for understanding the technical and tactical intersection for people that were unfamiliar with a range of sports. So if you'd never taught rugby before and you wanted to use a game-based approach, it was all laid out there in a sequence of lessons that developed from simple to complex over time in a very logical order, with everything that you would need just to pick it up. The recipe was there, go and do it. Brilliant for novices who don't have the pedagogical or content knowledge to figure it out for themselves. The game sense approach, I would argue, is non-linear because the original description of it, which I have with the Perceptions and Actions research report from a person who worked at the Sports Commission at the time, doesn't provide a formula or a series of steps. It says the game is the focus of the practice session. Practice session might start with a game, not the practice session will. So the only instruction is the game is the focus of the session. So what does that mean? There's a lot of interpretation there. If the game is the focus of the practice session and you see players not performing in the game, you've got some flexibility of teaching style to help that player improve their game performance rather than getting them to keep playing the game and keep playing. And as I was thinking of that, I was mindful again of, Alan Launder sitting on my shoulder going, just because people are playing a game doesn't mean they will improve. In fact, they just might become better at doing the things they can already do. And if the things they can already do are not very good, they will become better at doing things that are not very good. And he used to call that dead-end techniques that will take you to be successful to a point, but no further. And what tends to happen is those players have to unlearn those dead-end techniques in order to be able to, again, accelerate their development as players.
Well, you're offering a neat segue onto my next question, because whether it's Alan Launder or whether it's your old colleague Brian, who sort of said when you were saying, oh, I really love the way you coach, I need to inject this game stuff into my coaching. And Brian was going, well, I'm kind of looking at yours and I think I need to do a bit more drilling. you're speaking to, we can't just play games because, as appropriate as they might be for engagement and a great degree of learning. I know in Australia you speak about craft work, a player's craft work. We want to develop the technical skills of players. So if you're a coach who's taking a games-based approach and you're looking on in and you're seeing a player or a number of players who you immediately identify, your observation, you identify that, wow, they need to work on this technique here, whatever that might be kicking, handling, might be a combination of things. Does a game-based approach prevent you from going in and doing some kind of activity or drill or something like that with an individual or with a small group of players? How does that fit into? How does individual and small group development, technical development, fit into this games-based approach?
There are a couple of ways, and again, it would depend on which game-based approach you decide to choose. So I'll talk very broadly. The original Game Sense video showed representations of what you're talking about, and they used an Australian football, AFL, as some people call it, example, where a player wasn't succeeding with handball. Their technique was going to lead to them to be called for a throw in the game. And despite the coach asking questions, providing cueing, the player just wasn't getting the assembly of the movement right. So the player was extracted out from the game, worked on the sideline with that coach, really intensively on the compliance of techniques to the rules of the game, and then the player was reinserted back into the game. So right from the beginning of the Game Sense approach, it was demonstrated that there is a place for drills. The nuance, not the nuance, that's a poor word, the mastery of the coach is to be able to go, this is what I think this player needs in order to help them move forward. So that when they are intervening, their intervening has meaning, or I use the word purpose. It's intentional, it's purposeful, and therefore it's explicit because it's going in there with that clear intent. The Game Sense, using a Game Sense approach, well, it could be during the warm-up that there is a focus on technique because the task has been simplified down into maybe a closed drill, then into an open drill with more decisions, some defensive pressure. I call that prep to play. So the players are doing their prep to play, and then when they come over to me, we're into our first gameplay. Now, I'm a teacher, so I think of these things from an educational perspective. And so that first gameplay for me is retrieval practice, where the players are doing the things that they know, do, and understand, or that I expect that they know, do, and understand. And I'm using that as an opportunity to assess whether my knowledge of the players is actually accurate, or whether there are players that are not where I was expecting them to be, or there are players that are ahead of where I would expect them to be. Maybe they're doing extras outside of training, they've got a private coach or whatever. So that retrieval practice enables me to do my first round of assessment. So that's really an inquiry piece. Then I'll inquire with the players, focusing down on what the purpose of the practice session is, what our learning outcomes, objectives are, and what we're trying to achieve from it, asking questions around how we're performing towards demonstration of the learning outcome. And then I've got a decision to make. Do I go back into the play in order to get more consolidation of what I expect them to know, do, and understand, because I think they need that further consolidation? Are there some players that need to be extracted out and have a different task because they're currently not meeting the expectations of the game? Is that extraction out into a simplified version of the game? Is it into some reciprocal coaching? Is it into a practice style task? Is it into a self-directed task where there's an iPad station set up and they look at the iPad and they use that as the guide to the task they're required to perform? There are many different ways that could happen. But at some stage, I want to test whether those practices are having an impact on their play performance, and so they need to return to play. So for me, the practice session after the prep to play will be bracketed by play periods. Also, because I coach in a team environment, I might be moving from general principles of how we will play to a structure, what Grahanya and others would call the system, teaching the system, so the players can have some sense of anticipation of what teammates will do in the moment, and therefore, through that anticipation, be able to get into better positions to be of value to the play, because they can have some sort of prediction occurring based on what we've been modelling are the outcomes that we're hoping for from various scenarios in the play. And again, if I think back to something that I read from Rick Charlesworth's work, he said, if the players don't know the solution to the moment in the game, then that's a reflection of me on the coach, because I haven't provided them a chance to practice that to the point that they know what to do in that moment.
As a psychologist listening to you, one word that's coming to mind here, rightly or wrongly.
I hope it's a good word.
Oh, it's a very simple word. It's probably a rubbish word. Memory. Memory is in you're starting with a retrieval game. You talked about knowing, doing, and understanding. You're testing their knowing, doing, and understanding. Can I just pause there and ask you, what are you doing as a coach when they are doing this initial game? Are you observing? Are you assessing? Are you just letting them get on with it and just allowing that to be kind of like a warm-up?
Now, the warm-up is the prep to play.
Sure. Okay.
So once we start playing the game, we're into an educative context. Yeah. And my role there is the sports coach's teacher, sports coach's educator, to borrow from Robin Jones.
Okay.
So I'm thinking about who I need to speak with, what I need to speak to them about, and how that conversation needs to occur. Yeah. Is it going to be an inquiry conversation? Is it going to be a direct instruction? Am I going to provide a reminder of the cue to see if that tumbles out into their understanding? I'm doing that diagnostic piece to think about how I'm going to come in to have an impact. So it's assessment, it's observation for the purpose of assessment that will then provide feedback to the players or the playing group, depending upon what I'm seeing.
Would you say there's a memory piece there?
Yes. Again, I'm informed by educational psychology ideas, and memory is a strong part of that. So yes, I'm expecting the players to know, so therefore remember decision-making choices, how we want to work on the ball and off the ball. To give you an example, and some of this language I've borrowed from another coach, Narelle, and I'll give her credit for the language here. But what we're working on during pre-season is two things. We're working on our defensive shape with defender number 1 press, defender number 2 is a role, not an individual. Defender number 2 has to cover the outlet pass. Defender number 3 moves into a position to sweep. That creates a diamond structure in front of the player with the ball. So we've been practicing defender 1, defender 2, defender 3 roles. That's a memory. The players need to know, and that's a memory thing. And then we're able to show vision of it when they get the shape right, when they don't get the shape right. Was it just not processing the moment, recognizing the moment, have those conversations? The other piece that we're working on at the moment is technique going into contest. Concussion is a big issue in contact sports. So we're teaching body shape going into contest so that they get their body, so their head is not a target to the incoming tackle player. So we'll use cues, for example, head over the ball, bottom to the ground, fingers brush the grass. So that there are those 3 memory pegs for the shape that they should be in at the moment that they make contact with the ball. Now, if they put their step over the ball, bum to the ground, fingers to the grass, they've got a very strong centre of gravity, which is going to be difficult to be knocked off the ball. They've probably presented their shoulder or their back to the opposition. So if the opposition does run into them, they're going to get a free kick for a push in the back. They're not going to get a free kick for a high contact in the head. We don't want high head contact, even though it gives us a free kick. Now, having established that going into contest, we want step over the ball, bottom to the ground, fingers scrape the grass. We need number 2 to get into the view. The number 2 offensive player needs to be reading my body shape and running into my view so that as number 1 gets the job done by picking up the ball or winning possession of the ball, can get it to number 2 who's worked into the view. So we're cueing, and players are using those cues as a memory peg for how they are to behave in the game. From a cognitive perspective, we're providing an advanced organiser for their thinking.
This is really interesting, Shane, because we're on essentially the first game here, which you're labelling as retrieval practice. Barrett Rosenshine talks about a review, if you like. Doug Lemov has been on the show talking a lot about the forgetting curve, that people forget things. Evidence suggests very quickly, even in the first few minutes. But players know that they're going to turn up to your session. They're going to do an activity that is going to test their memory. This is my term, not yours, but test their memory. You're talking about knowing, doing, understanding. You're checking for understanding. You're checking knowing. You're checking doing.
Yep.
This is like a review in many respects, but in there, that sophisticated coaching practice is reinforcing attentional cues.
Correct.
That's really important, and that can be as basic as kind of more basic action concepts, like static ones around that safe tackling. But then we might talk more about again, I'm going to use psychology terms here, rich and vivid and complex schemas for those who are scanning their environment. You want the intentional cues external. You want them scanning their environment. You want them picking up what will prompt them to make certain actions. That's what I'm hearing here. So whilst this is a retrieval practice in that very first game, there's a real rich landscape of coaching instruction that envelopes this session design in this first game. Am I reading this correctly?
I think you are. Yep.
Yeah. And then interestingly, you move on to be explicit about learning outcomes.
Yep.
Which to me is doing, I'm listening to that and I'm thinking that's two things. I'm giving players greater certainty, and I'm laying the platform for more explicit coaching here. Because when my players, I'm thinking as a psychologist, when they've got more certainty, when they know what this is for, when you're laying out intent, I wonder if that's turning up the volume of attention in parallel with intention, enables them to become more, I suppose, deliberate practices in many respects, because they know what this is for. No question, mate, but just, a thought there.
Oh, absolutely. I describe what I do as deliberate practice.
Okay, interesting.
Absolutely. I describe a game-based approach as deliberate practice, because if I go back to, I use the phrase play with purpose, because I saw what I believe to be a misunderstanding of a game-based approach, which is let the game be the teacher. Let the players play the game and they will find out. Well, some players may find out. Some players may have a parent who talks to them about stuff at home. They're watching the game analyzer on the TV, and when they play the game, they'll be able to figure it out. But allowing that to happen by chance doesn't mean you need a coach there. A coach is there to help accelerate the process in the time that you have available. So in order to accelerate the learning in the time that you have available, you need to be very intentional, very aware, so that you can be deliberate in your engagement with the learners, which in this case in sport are the players, at any level that you're working with.
As you were speaking there, I was thinking about how alive you've got to be as a coach to a player's, I'm going to use a horrible term here, but go with it, epistemological chain, which is the posh term for how have they acquired knowledge, where have they acquired knowledge, and what does this mean for what I'm seeing in front of me. We spoke about epistemological chain with Dr. Jamie Taylor on the Sports Search show before, and that's no small thing, I think. Interestingly, after you've talked to players about learning outcomes, you then talk about other activities and consolidation activity. And then from there, you're observing, and again, your approach I think it seems to me requires experience, because you spoke earlier about being alive to, okay, do I need to siphon off a certain player or certain groups of players depending on what I'm seeing within the activities that they're engaged in? You as a coach will have a session design, but it sounds to me like your session design is flexible in as much as if you're seeing something and you've got to shift quickly, you've got to siphon off a group of players or a player, take them out of that session design and go and do something else with them. You're going to go and do that. Is that fair to say that you have a session design, but that is that has a great degree of flexibility depending on what you're observing, and that's how you accommodate any kind of drill, individual activities, or deconstructed activities?
It's a yes with a but.
Okay.
Now, the reason for the but is if a coach, like a teacher, has good information on their players so that the coach has awareness of what they know, can do, and understand, then the coach is able to plan forward in anticipation of what they're likely to see.
Okay.
So I think it was Eric Worthington in his book in 1974 who wrote about the fact that the coach plays that game knowing that there's a moment in the game that they're waiting for. Might happen 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes. But it's that moment that the game is waiting for, because that's where the coach is coming in, because that's what they've anticipated will happen. And when it happens, that's when the education piece will start. So you can't do that if you don't know your players. You can't do that if you are not observing your players, annotating if that's what you do, so that you've got a basis for expectation of what will happen in that game episode. Now, if you're able to have an expectation of what's going to happen in that game episode, particularly if you have intentionally had that game in that way in anticipation of that moment, and if it's a moment where you expect some players or all players, the game's going to break down because they don't have the knowledge, skills, and understanding to deal with it, then you know what you're going to do next because you've planned for it, because you've constructed for it. So it's yes, you need to be alive to the moment, but in order to make sure that you keep reinforcing that notion of repetition without repetition, that you keep coming back to the learning intention in all the activities that you're doing. Yes, being alive to what's needed in the moment, but it's still making sure that what you put into place enables that repetition of the learning intention. It's not straying away from that. Again, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm guided by an understanding of cognitive dispersal, and the more things you throw into the environment, the less that's likely to stick, because there's just too much stuff to have paid attention to. So what they're likely to remember is the last thing you spoke to them about, which may not be the most important thing and may not be related to actually what you wanted them to learn that lesson. So keep returning to the idea. Keep returning to the thing that is what you're wanting them to learn, to know, do, and understand. Keep returning to it. But the tasks will be different, but they will be all hitting the same know, do, understand through the coaching session.
When you do take a player or players away because you want to work with that player or them on something specific, because you've noticed something or it's pre-planned that you're going to do that, you've used that term repetition without repetition, and we can think also of variability, randomization, things like that within activities that are important, because that makes the experience of doing those activities more like the game. Information is important. When we strip away information, we may lessen the ecological validity of what we're doing. So it might not what we're doing if we take a player away and we just work with them individually. If we work with a small group of players, we're stripping away so much information that what we then do with them, the argument out there can be is, well, you do it with this individual player or small groups of players, but there's so little information about the game in there that what you're doing isn't going to transfer into the real game. How do you guard against that? You've taken a player away, you're working with that one player, or you're taking 3 players away and you're working on, I don't know, a tackling activity where you're working on attentional cues to do with tackling. But then how do they transfer what they've learned in that information scarce environment activity? How do they then transfer that into the game? How do you enable that as a coach?
Perhaps it's not information scarcity, it's information precision, because
Okay.
you're honing in on a moment of the game, a very, very specific moment of the game.
Or an action, a specific moment of an action as well.
That moment requires an action.
Okay.
Yep.
Yep.
So there's a solution to the problem of that moment. So I know, I'll give you a very practical example. In Australian football, I know very few young footballers who inherently, just by playing the game, learn how to wedge a player underneath the ball and roll out of a contest. Right? It doesn't matter how many times you play a game and talk to them about it. I've not seen players just somehow inherently, by osmosis, attune themselves to be able to wedge and roll out of a contest. So that moment where you need to wedge your opponent underneath the ball so they're off balance, so that you can be the first to roll out of the contest to give the offensive advantage, we can isolate down to that moment. We can be very, very specific to the information of that moment and practice it and practice it and practice it, and then put them into contexts that represent a more dynamic environment to see if it sticks. And if it hasn't stuck, do we allow it to roll on for a little bit longer? That's our assessment piece. Okay, it didn't work the first time. Maybe they'll get it the second time. And then if they're just not getting it, you haven't developed the habit. And they're unlikely, in my experience, to develop the habit within the complexity of the game and all that other information they're trying to process. So I'm going to bring them back down to the specificity of the moment that will give them that advantage in that problem, win that ball in contest, so the ball's in the air, right? In Australian football, it could be a ruck situation where there's a set piece with a number of players around the ball. You want to actually get the ball on the outside of the contest. If the opposition get the ball on the inside of the contest, you can tackle them and keep them there, so that's okay. But what you want to be able to do is be first out of the contest. So you've got to get underneath the armpit at the right moment, lift that person off the ball so they're off balance, and then be able to roll off. Because they're off balance, they can't chase you straight away. So you've got a couple of steps on them before they can get balanced and accelerate away, and you've provided that person with a tactical advantage.
I love that idea of information precision. Let's work together briefly here, if we can, to frame this from a theoretical perspective. We spoke to Professor Nikki Hodges and Professor Keith Lowes on the Sports Psych show about their updated version of the challenge point. And they talked about specificity and functional difficulty being important here. That as we become more as we create an activity that is more information precise, so we're stripping back the information, but we're just working on tackling, let's say with 3, 4, 5 players. We're making the specificity with low specificity because it looks less like the game because we haven't got all the players around them. Lowering functional difficulty because, it's less difficult to tackle somebody if they're not on the move, which is probably where the activity is going to be. So low functional difficulty, low specificity there. And what I'm hearing you say is then that's an activity we can build upon. So we'll work on some attentional cues in that activity that's low specificity, low functional difficulty, and then we can build from there. But the key element here sounds to me like the coach. The coach is a key ingredient in terms of building player skill because we engage players in that simple activity. But then as a coach, we've got to observe them in a more dynamic environment with higher specificity and higher functional difficulty. The game itself, if you like, or a small-sided game, where we observe the tackling that we've just been teaching. And we observe, is that becoming a habit? Are they doing that correctly? And now our job as a coach is to help that form of tackling become a habit. No question, Shane, but that's kind of what's rifling in between my ears.
I think you've described it very well. Can you come and teach my skill acquisition class? I like the way you framed that.
No. No, I won't be able to do it better than you. But I think it's fascinating. So, I think what's really, really interesting is being able to frame the practical world into the, envelope it into the theoretical. And coaches don't have to do that, do they? But if they have that, then potentially, arguably, they are engaging. They are designing sessions. They are creating activities, and they're engaging players in this quite rich landscape of coaching, and their professional judgment becomes a little bit more advanced, perhaps. Their decision making as a coach becomes a bit more advanced, possibly, if they are underpinned by these theories. That might be an argument to make. Rather than, I'm just guessing here. I'm kind of guessing with what I'm doing. I'm actually leaning on some theories that might be useful.
I think theories are terrific for actually giving you a substantiation of why what you're doing has an effect. Okay.
It's the why.
Yeah. So why do this rather than that? You need to have a justification. And it needs to be more than, for me, it needs to be more than anecdote. So what does the evidence tell you about X and Y to give you a judgment as to which one has the higher value, so that you're informed in your decision making?
I love that.
But as you hear me talking, I mean, I come from a pedagogical basis. When I came to work at Flinders University, there was an associate professor at the counter, and he'd been there a long time. He said, "Oh, you're the new young phys editor." Okay, so I was early 40s at that stage. I said, "Yep." He said, "So what's your area of research? Is it biomechanics? Is it skill acquisition? Is it exercise physiology?" And here I am thinking, I've been a teacher for 18 years. I don't have a research area. What am I interested in? And I said, I'm interested in pedagogy. And he leaned in and he said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah, I'm interested in how people teach and the outcomes of that teaching and why you would choose to teach something this way rather than that way. Pedagogy. I'm going to be researching pedagogy." He said, "Really?" And I thought, that's strange. I'm in a school of education and someone's questioning why I would be interested in pedagogy. And that's where my research interest lies, in teaching and the decisions that underpin teaching it this way rather than that way. And my colleague Brendan Soucy was quite influential about 5 or 6 years ago. He said, "I'm writing this paper on game-based approaches because I keep hearing people talking about game-based approaches as guided discovery, and I don't think they are. I read the illustrations in the books, and it could be any game-based approach that he's talking about here." And he said, "I think most of the questions are operating at retrieval practice. They're practice. Yes, they're questions, but at no stage is the question, what do you already know about this? Okay, you're not able to use any of those things. You got to find another thing to solve the problem. Now we're in discovery. But if you don't know what the players know, you don't know whether they're discovering or whether they're just doing what they can already do." I thought, wow, that's right. None of the descriptions of a constraints-led approach, game sense approach, TGFU start with a question, what do you already know about this? Great, park that, can't use any of it anymore. You got to find a novel way of doing things. And it was Brendan that made me realise that the language of a game-based approach being a way of coaching was inaccurate, because coaching is episodic. It's a series of discrete episodes. And each of those episodes, you make a decision around how best to teach for the learner outcomes associated with that episode. And it's quite legitimate to have an episode which is practice style because you're wanting the players to retrieve in order to do the assessment piece. And there are safety considerations like in tackles where I'm not going to let the players go and discover how to do a tackle by attuning themselves to the information in the environment. Because if they get hurt, that's on me because I've allowed them to explore. And oops, someone's just hurt their neck. That's my fault. So I'm going to have a very command style of instruction because my primary responsibility is safety of my players. If I'm teaching young athletes to throw the javelin, I'm not saying go out and explore how to throw a javelin and map your ability to the environment. I'm going to have a throwing line and I'm going to have a safety line. And only people who are throwing the javelin are on the throwing line. And they don't throw until I give the command to throw. And they don't walk into the landing space until they get my instruction to move into the landing space. And then they will bring the javelin back. They will swap with the other people who come forward. And then they don't throw until I give the instruction. So pacing and timing are under my control because I'm the one that needs to keep them safe. Safety is the prime thing. So there are some activities where that you have to have a very much a command and practice style pedagogy because the environments are dangerous for people that don't know what they're doing.
Well, we're only an hour in, and we've started to talk about what we were originally coming on here to discuss. Shows what a great host I am. The mere hour. Well, it shows how into what we've been talking about. But
one of the things that I've learnt later in life is that people are stories, and people engage through stories. And so I reckon that's absolutely cool what you've just done. You've drawn out my story, and I'm privileged to have had that opportunity to have someone interested in my story and draw it out. Because at the end of the day, as humans, that's what we are. We're stories. Our life is a story.
Well said.
And for another person to take an interest in our story is a privilege.
Well, we're an hour in, and you've started to speak to what we actually came on here to talk about, which is teaching styles. And I don't know if you think that this might be an important point for me to make, but whenever anybody utters the word style in and around coaching, I know a lot of people, those in the know, might immediately start thinking about learning styles. And I can envisage a barrage of Twitter messages going, learning styles are debunked. So let's make it clear, we're talking teaching styles here and not learning styles, aren't we?
Yes, if it helps, we'll call them pedagogies.
We can call them pedagogies. And you've used some words here, command, you talked about guided discovery. I mean, you've given us some wonderful examples already of what we might describe different teaching styles. And these teaching styles are along a spectrum. In fact, there's a term here, the spectrum of teaching styles. We're a mere hour into this, Shane, but why don't you speak a little bit? I mean, it's wonderful because we can have we can simply have a part 2 to this discussion at some point in the near future. But why don't we, if you can speak a little bit to the spectrum of teaching styles, I know that will finish off the podcast nicely. We can go into a little bit of depth here before we finish.
I knew nothing of the spectrum of teaching styles until I came to Flinders University, and my colleague Russell Brown was using it as the pedagogical foundation for quality teaching physical education. So the Flinders University graduates began with, before we get into models and other things, you're going to be grounded in this spectrum of teaching styles as a lens to think about quality teaching. And then it was a number of years later that I went to the 2009 ACHBA International Conference in Brisbane at QUT, and Sarah Ashworth was one of the keynotes, and she was running some workshops on the spectrum of teaching styles, and I got to understand it a little bit more. And then Brendan Susi, who I talked about before, got in contact with me and offered that challenge on what a game-based approach is and is not. And we started to collaborate on writing about the spectrum of teaching styles. And in particular, we started to write about a non-versus approach to pedagogy. Fundamental to the spectrum of teaching styles is that no teaching style is of itself wrong. It is only applied wrongly. So it's mismatched to the learning intention. So from a teaching perspective, command style pedagogy is not bad or wrong. It's only wrongly used. Reciprocal coaching or peer coaching is not bad or wrong. It's only wrongly applied by the coach. So being able to intentionally match the teaching style for the learning intention to get the outcome that you hope for from the players becomes part of the craft, pedagogical mastery of the teacher, in this case, the sports coach. And Mostyn in the 1960s, you can say discovered, although the pedagogies were already there, what he did was lay them out on a continuum from those that were most under the control of the teacher. The teacher was making all the decisions around timing, spacing, content, intention, down to the other end where the athlete or the learner was making all of the decisions around how to learn, what to learn, when to learn it, why to learn it, and what the measurements of success would be. And he said that roughly the spectrum could be divided into two clusters, which were reproduction, where the athlete, the learner, was essentially reproducing what the coach was asking for, and then production pedagogies, where the learner was having some control over what was being learnt. And the further you move to the right-hand side of the spectrum, not only control over what was being learnt, but how it was being learnt as well. But integral is this non-versus idea that no teaching style is of itself bad or wrong. So Brendan and I started to do some conceptual writing looking at different game-based approaches from a non-versus perspective as episodic and therefore a cluster of coaching styles, or teaching styles if we're looking at it from a phys ed point of view. Looking at some of the examples from the literature and going, in the literature, this is described as a discovery episode, but we might contest based on the verbal instructions that are being provided to the players. It's actually a practice episode.
That's really interesting. That highlights coaching as a series of episodes, that I as a coach don't have to be burdened by the notion that I have to coach in one particular way or with one particular style. That maybe if we put aside bullying and any kind of pernicious isms that are out there, that there's no such thing really as incorrect coaching. There's a certain style related to your intentions, that there's no wrong, but you really have to, it's paramount to make sure that you match style with intention.
Correct. So from a spectrum of teaching styles language, it starts at pre-impact when you're doing your planning,
Okay.
so that you can deliberately, intentionally, purposely align the teaching style to the task for the outcome that you hope for. So we talk about planning at pre-impact. That's the design. And then at impact, you actually get to see whether you got the alignment right, which then allows you post-impact to reflect on whether you had the necessary impact on the learning outcome because you got the alignment of task and pedagogy correct.
Shane, I'm going to read out the teaching styles, and maybe you've spoken a bit to guided discovery. You've spoken a bit to command, for example. I'm sure you've spoken a bit to the others, but perhaps you can give us some examples to bring some of these alive. There'll be some familiar words and content in here, but teaching styles from A to K starts with command, practice, reciprocal,
Yep.
self-check, inclusion, guided discovery, convergent discovery, divergent discovery, learner-designed individual program, learner-initiated self-teaching. So I assume there's the order, the continuum, if you like. I don't know if you want to pick and choose a couple of those and maybe bring those alive a little bit, some practical examples.
Maths is not my strong point, so trying to remember that list is going to be a bit difficult. A, B, C, D. So it might be easier if you just ask me. Pick one at random. Let's explore it.
Okay. Let's go with G and H. Convergent discovery is G, and H is divergent discovery.
Convergent discovery is asking a series of questions which will go to an answer. There's only one possibility in this chain of questioning. We will lead to this answer. In divergent discovery, we are looking for the range of possibilities. So we recognize that there is more than one solution to the problem of the moment. And then we can negotiate with the players whether we explore all of those possibilities or through some type of consensus decide on the possibility we like the best and we'll go and practice that. But it recognises that there are multiple possibilities. It's divergent.
Going down the list, thank you for that. Going down the list towards the bottom, and so a greater sense maybe of being player-driven or player-centered, if we're going to use those terms. I, J, and K are learner. I is learner-designed individual program. J is learner-initiated. K is self-teaching. Well, why might coaches use those styles? Again, if you have any examples of why you might use those styles in your coaching practice, that would be useful.
So learner initiated is where the player designs what they believe they need and will come to a coach to help them observe that practice and provide the feedback. So they've initiated it. They may even co-construct it with the coach.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's not the coach initiating the conversation around this is what I think you need. It's the learner coming back going, this is what I reckon I need to do. Now, the next step on is from the learner going, I reckon this is what I need to do to become better in the game, learner initiated, to the learner going, this is what I need to do and this is how I reckon I might practice it. And then down the other end, the learner's going, this is what I need to do. This is how I'm going to do it. And this is how I know I'm going to be successful. And I think this is a good example. The Craig Johnson story is one of the best books that I read, but the story of a 15-year-old who's the whiz kid of Australian football comes out to the first trial game and is miles off the pace compared to the local apprentices and gets told to go home, but doesn't have the money to be able to go home, so is secreted away from the gaffer. Is that the right term?
Yep.
While he works to save enough money, because plane trips in the early 70s were relative to wage a lot more expensive than what they are now, to go back home. And meanwhile, he's telling the story that he's telling his parents, everything's going great, I'm going well. He sets up in the car park a practice gym. Yep. And that practice gym is all closed drills. He's also playing street football with the local kids. So this combination of the closed drills, and he talks about, I can't remember his acronym, but he talks about intentionally thinking through the elements of the game that he needs to improve and designing this practice gym to do that. And then he's playing street football with the kids. And then a year and a half later, the shorter players, they're looking like they might have to forfeit a game. And everyone goes, well, what about Skippy? What do you mean Skippy's still here? I sent him home 18 months ago. No, he's still here. All right, he can sit on the bench because that way we'll get a game because we've got someone on the bench. And short period into the game, he's called on because someone's injured. He scores 2 goals and his career's away. And everyone's going, who's been coaching him? No one had been coaching him. He'd been coaching himself, 15 years of age. And he'd been coaching himself. So what I gather from that is that the styles are not age-related. You don't progress through these necessarily based on chronological age, but he was smart enough to be able to figure out what he needed, had enough practice from being coached over time to figure out tasks to develop his practice gym in the car park. And he was using his street soccer, I guess, to keep, as he described it, match fit. But in his video of it, he seems to suggest that it's those closed drills in the car park that were the significant thing in improving his football.
Very meaningful story to me because in the late 80s I grew up a Spurs, a Tottenham Hotspur supporter, but my second team was Wimbledon. So Wimbledon, I think that's the team that Craig Johnson played for at the time. So it reminds me of, we had Jay Demerit on the Sports Psych show, the American soccer player who went from the 9th division to the Premier League and attributed a lot of the work he did away from the pitch with his closed skills drills. That story really reminded me of him. Listen, Shane, I'm very mindful of your time. You've been very generous with it. And I do think that we've kind of teased the listeners with some knowledge around these styles of coaching, and what it means is there's definitely an excuse to bring you back and talk more about these styles and continue to bring them alive. Where can people find you, follow you? And I know you have a brilliant book out on teaching styles. Where can people find that book?
The Spectrum of Sport Coaching Styles is available from Routledge. Easy to Google that and it'll take you straight to the website. I can be found at Flinders University. Google Shane Pill at Flinders University. You'll get my homepage. That'll give you an email address. I've got a blog, Learning Through Sport. It's been going for about 8 years now. So there's a 40, 50, 60 blog posts people can read on various aspects of sports coaching, physical education, some of it translating some of the research we've done, other people's research, and talking through some of the ideas and also confusions that I've had trying to use that writing to sort out my own thoughts. So they're the 3 probably main ways. I tend to be found on LinkedIn more than Twitter these days, but I do have a Twitter handle as well, at Pilly66.
Brilliant. Shane, can't thank you enough for your time. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's a privilege to have the opportunity to have a chat.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show, and I'd be delighted to hear any suggestions that you do have. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.